Picture this. March 13th, 1989. It's 2:44 in the morning. You're asleep in your Montreal apartment. The temperature outside is minus 15 degrees Celsius. Your heating system hums quietly. Your refrigerator clicks. The city sleeps. Then, at 2:45 a.m., everything dies. Not a flicker. Not a brownout. Everything. In 92 seconds flat, the entire province of Quebec's power grid collapses. 6 million people wake up in complete darkness, no heat, no light, no communication. The Montreal Metro stops mid-tunnel. Pumping stations fail. Hospitals scramble. Streetlights go dark across an area larger than France. And the cause? Not a bomb, not a terror attack, not even a hurricane. A storm on the surface of the sun, 150 million kilometers away, sent an invisible shockwave through space that hit Earth and fried Quebec's electrical infrastructure like a microwave hitting a circuit board. 9 hours. That's how long most of Quebec survived without power in the dead of a Canadian winter. Here's what keeps me up at night. The geomagnetic storm that hit Quebec in 1989 was rated X15. Scientists estimate the 1859 Carrington Event, the largest solar storm in recorded history, was roughly 10 times more powerful. If that storm hit Earth today with our current grid infrastructure, the damage would be catastrophic. Not for 9 hours, for months. So the question that actually matters isn't, could this happen again? It's what did 6 million Canadians do right? Why, and what did they do catastrophically wrong? I went through the emergency management reports, the survivor testimonies, the engineering post-mortems, and the policy reviews that followed Quebec 1989. Not theory, not speculation, historical forensics. By the end of this script, you'll know exactly what saved people, what failed them, and what the pattern tells us about every infrastructure collapse that's happened since. First, understand the mechanism. Because this wasn't a random event, the sun runs on an 11-year activity cycle. During solar maximum, the sun ejects massive bursts of magnetized plasma called coronal mass ejections, or CMEs. When a CME hits Earth, it compresses our planet's magnetic field, which generates electrical currents in the ground itself. These ground-induced currents flow into anything conductive connected to the Earth, like power lines, like transformers. Quebec's grid was uniquely vulnerable for 3 reasons. First, the Canadian Shield, the ancient rock formation underlying Quebec, is highly resistive to electrical current. That forces ground-induced currents to travel through man-made conductors instead, meaning the power grid itself became a lightning rod for the entire geomagnetic storm. Second, Quebec's transmission lines are extraordinarily long. Hydro-Quebec was built to carry power from remote northern hydroelectric dams to southern population centers, sometimes across distances of over 1,000 kilometers. Longer lines absorb more induced current. Third, no one had designed for this. The engineers who built Quebec's grid didn't account for geomagnetic storms because the last event of comparable magnitude, the 1921 storm, had occurred before modern high-voltage infrastructure existed. The result? At 2:44 a.m. on March 13, 1989, the entire grid collapsed in 92 seconds. 7 static VAR compensators tripped in sequence, then 5 major transmission lines, then the entire provincial grid, gone. Same pattern we see in every infrastructure collapse. Cascading failure. One weak link triggers another, faster than any human operator can respond. Weimar Germany's economic collapse didn't happen in a day, but Quebec's grid did. One domino, then the rest. What saved people? The 5 things that worked. Number 1, thermal mass. This is the single most underestimated survival asset in a cold weather blackout, and most people have no idea they're already sitting on top of it. A well-insulated house in Quebec in 1989 didn't go from 20 degrees Celsius to minus 15 in 9 hours. It dropped on average 1 to 2 degrees per hour in the first several hours. That's physics. Thermal mass, the stored heat energy in walls, floors, furniture, and bodies, bleeds slowly. The survivors who stayed warmest weren't the ones who panicked and started burning whatever they could find. They were the ones who understood what they already had. Doors stayed closed. Families gathered in single rooms. Body heat was pooled. Blankets and sleeping bags were layered. Rural Quebecers with older, wood-framed homes that had been retrofitted with extra insulation reported maintaining comfortable temperatures throughout the entire 9-hour outage. Newer apartment towers with large glass surfaces and poor insulation dropped faster. The lesson the post-mortems hammered home: thermal mass is a survival asset you build before the event. Every dollar spent on insulation before a crisis is worth $100 spent on emergency heating during one. Number 2, wood stoves and alternative heat sources. Quebec's rural population fared dramatically better than its urban population during the 1989 blackout. The margin wasn't close. The reason was simple and one generation deep. Rural Quebec households, particularly those outside Montreal and Quebec City, had retained wood stoves as supplemental heating even as electric baseboard heating became standard. Not because anyone anticipated a grid collapse, because old habits die hard in the countryside and firewood is cheap. When the grid went down, these households lit their wood stoves and continued functioning almost normally. Coffee got made on wood fires. Soup got heated. Families stayed warm. Urban apartment dwellers had nothing. No fireplace, no stove, no alternative. They had electric baseboard heaters that required exactly the thing that had just disappeared. The post-mortem is brutal in its clarity. The communities that retained pre-industrial infrastructure redundancy survived better than those that had fully modernized. Progress in this case meant vulnerability. This same pattern appears in every modern infrastructure collapse. Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria in 2017. Texas during the February 2021 freeze. Communities that had retained older, decentralized, fuel-independent systems survived better than those fully dependent on centralized electric infrastructure. The critical distinction: an alternative heat source is only useful if you have fuel for it. Neighbors who had wood stoves but hadn't stocked wood were in the same situation as neighbors with electric heaters. The asset without the supply chain is worthless. Number 3, community networks and social capital. Here's what the emergency management reports found that surprised even the researchers. The survival outcomes in Quebec 1989 correlated more strongly with neighborhood social cohesion than with individual preparedness levels. People who knew their neighbors checked on each other. And elderly residents who lived alone were visited. Households with wood stoves took in households without them. People who had extra blankets shared. People who had food cooked communal meals. The apartment buildings with active resident communities fared better than the ones where people didn't know each other's names. This isn't sentiment, it's documented. The official post-mortem from Quebec's emergency management identified social isolation as a primary risk multiplier. People who were socially isolated were more likely to make dangerous decisions. Light candles in enclosed spaces. Use outdoor grills indoors for heat. Fail to seek help when they needed it. And this pattern repeats across every disaster on record. The 1995 Chicago heatwave killed over 700 people. The mortality rate was dramatically higher in socially isolated neighborhoods than in equally poor neighborhoods with strong social networks. After Katrina, the communities that recovered fastest weren't the wealthiest ones. They were the ones with the strongest pre-existing mutual aid networks. Social capital is a survival asset. It cannot be purchased at the last minute. It has to be built before you need it. Number 4, analog communication and local information. At 2:45 a.m. on March 13, 1989, the phone still worked. Not because anyone planned for it, because telephone infrastructure in 1989 ran on its own dedicated power systems, completely separate from the grid. Battery-backed telephone exchanges, analog signals, physical copper wire, AM radio stations with emergency backup generators stayed on the air. Quebec residents with battery-operated radios were able to receive continuous updates on the situation. They knew within hours that it was a geomagnetic event, not a military attack. They knew restoration timelines. They knew which emergency shelters were open and where. People without radios knew nothing. In a 9-hour information vacuum, rumors spread. Some apartment buildings saw tenants attempt to evacuate unnecessarily, creating dangerous crowding in freezing stairwells, because they had no way of knowing the blackout was temporary and restoration was underway. The lesson: information asymmetry during a crisis is itself a survival variable. The person with the battery radio, who knew what was happening, made better decisions than the person in the dark in both senses of the word. Now fast forward to a 2024 infrastructure collapse. On the landline telephone infrastructure is largely decommissioned. Cell towers have backup batteries measured in hours, not days. The information survival advantage of 1989 no longer exists by default. Number 5. Pre-positioned physical supplies. Quebec in March is not a climate that forgives improvisation. The households that navigated the 9-hour blackout with minimal disruption had, by accident or design, certain physical supplies already in place. Candles, matches, flashlights with working batteries, water in containers that didn't require electrical pumping, non-perishable food that didn't require cooking. The households that struggled had none of this. By the time they started improvising, it was dark, cold, and already past the point of easy solutions. This sounds obvious. And yet the post-mortem documentation from Quebec Emergency Management is full of anecdotes about people who were completely unprepared for a scenario that could have been addressed with $50 worth of supplies stored in a closet. The cigarette currency phenomenon from post-World War II Germany applies here. When formal systems fail, whoever has basic consumables has leverage. In Quebec, 1989, the households with candles and matches became de facto community hubs. People naturally gathered where there was light. The tactical supply list isn't complicated. Water, light source, heat source, food that requires no preparation, basic medical supplies, a way to receive information, but all of it must exist before the event, not after. Check what failed, the 3 things that went to zero. Number 1. An electric-dependent infrastructure without backup power. Every system in Quebec that relied on grid power without independent backup failed simultaneously. Water treatment plants, pumping stations, traffic signals, hospital non-critical systems, commercial refrigeration, gas station pumps, ATMs. The ATM failure created a secondary crisis. In 1989, cash was still the primary transaction medium, but by modern standards, the lesson is sharper. In a grid failure, any system that requires electricity to access your money becomes inaccessible. Card terminals fail, ATMs fail, point-of-sale systems fail. The hospital system in Quebec survived 1989 relatively well because major hospitals had diesel generator backup, but smaller clinics and pharmacies did not. And access to medication became a critical issue within hours for people who needed refrigerated medications or who couldn't access pharmacies that couldn't open their electronic doors. Number 2, centralized just-in-time supply chains. By 1989, Quebec's urban food supply had already transitioned to the modern just-in-time delivery model. Grocery stores didn't carry large inventory reserves. Warehouses didn't stockpile. Everything was calibrated to arrive exactly when needed. A 9-hour blackout didn't break this system, but the Quebec ice storm of 1998, which caused outages lasting up to 5 weeks in some areas, exposed the catastrophic fragility of this model completely. By day 3, grocery store shelves were empty in many communities. Supply chain disruption cascaded faster than emergency restocking could compensate. The pattern: systems optimized for efficiency are fragile by design. Resilience requires redundancy. Redundancy is inefficient by definition. Modern supply chains chose efficiency. The bill comes due in the crisis. Number 3, overconfidence in infrastructure permanence. The most dangerous thing the people of Quebec had in 1989 was an assumption so deeply embedded they didn't even recognize it as an assumption. The grid will always work. Hydro-Quebec had been extraordinarily reliable. Power outages in Quebec before 1989 were measured in minutes, occasionally hours. The idea that the entire provincial grid could go dark at once, simultaneously in the middle of a winter night, was outside the mental model of virtually every resident. This overconfidence meant no preparation. It meant no supplies. It meant no plans. And the residents who fared worst weren't the poorest or the most isolated geographically. They were the ones who had never seriously considered that the infrastructure they depended on could fail. This same failure of imagination appears in every infrastructure collapse. Texas residents in 2021 didn't believe their grid could fail in winter Because Texas winters were supposed to be mild. Louisiana residents didn't believe the levees could fail because FEMA said they wouldn't, lulled by past success into assuming future immunity. Here were the contemporary warning signs. In 2019, a geomagnetic storm classified as G2, moderate by solar storm standards, caused temporary disruptions to GPS systems and radio communications across North America. In 2022, CME arrived unexpectedly and destroyed 40 of SpaceX's Starlink satellites that had just been deployed. The storm wasn't predicted. The losses were immediate. We are currently in solar cycle 25. Solar maximum, the peak of this activity cycle, is projected to occur in 2025. Scientists at NOAA's Space Weather Prediction Center have noted that solar cycle 25 is tracking significantly stronger than predicted. The Carrington Event of 1859 caused telegraph systems around the world to fail, catch fire, and shock operators. Some telegraph systems continued operating on the induced current alone, even after being disconnected from their power sources. A storm of that magnitude today, hitting a planet whose entire economic and social infrastructure runs on electrical systems, is not a scenario with a measured recovery time. It's a scenario where the word recovery becomes aspirational. The Federal Emergency Management Agency in the United States has conducted classified and unclassified assessments of geomagnetic storm scenarios. The unclassified findings suggest that a Carrington-level event affecting the North American grid could leave 20 to 40 million people without power for periods ranging from weeks to over a year, depending on transformer replacement timelines. Replacement of large high-voltage transformers, the kind that failed in Quebec in 1989, typically requires 12 to 18 months. The United States maintains a strategic reserve of spare transformers. It is universally considered insufficient, with the pattern and what it demands. 6 million Quebecers survived 9 hours because the failure was temporary and the temperature was survivable. The 5 things that saved them: thermal mass already stored in buildings, alternative heat sources from an earlier era of technology, community networks built over years of proximity, analog communication systems that operated independently of the grid, and pre-positioned physical supplies. The 3 things that failed: electric-dependent infrastructure with no backup, just-in-time supply chains with no buffer, and the mental model that assumed the failure was impossible. Quebec 1989 is a gift. It's a full-scale live exercise of grid collapse at manageable severity, with detailed post-mortem documentation, conducted on a modern population in a modern city in a modern winter. The pattern it reveals is not complicated. Centralized, electricity-dependent, efficiency-optimized systems fail completely when the grid fails. Decentralized, redundant, physically based systems keep functioning. The communities that survived best in 1989 weren't the ones that had predicted the solar storm. Nobody predicted it. They were the ones who had, through habit, tradition, or rural pragmatism, retained enough pre-grid capability to function when the grid disappeared. That isn't luck. That's a structural property, and structural properties can be built intentionally. You don't need to become a prepper. You don't need a bunker. You need insulation in your walls, an alternative heat source with 30 days of fuel, a battery radio, 2 weeks of water, or 2 weeks of food that doesn't require cooking, cash outside the banking system, and neighbors whose names you know. 9 hours was survivable with improvisation. 5 weeks, as 1998 proved, requires infrastructure, and a Carrington event doesn't give you a timeline to improvise against. The most important lesson from Quebec 1989 isn't technical, it's psychological. The people who suffered most weren't underprepared. They were confidently unprepared. They had absolute faith in a system they had never considered losing. Don't be that person standing in the dark at 2:45 a.m., wondering why the lights aren't coming back on. The pattern is documented. The warning signs are live. The question is whether you're looking at the forensics before you become a case study. If this analysis made you look at your own infrastructure dependency differently, subscribe. This channel is historical forensics for modern decisions. Drop a candle emoji in the comments if you've already started thinking about your backup plan. Go build redundancy before you need it.